Hello everyone, it's Jabbar here. When we look at a map of today's world, we can easily identify which regions were formerly colonized by European empires and which ones weren't. This is apparent in the fact that former colonies are typically much larger than most other countries. A few examples of these are countries such as the United States, Australia, and Russia. Former colonies also often consist of straight lines for their international boundaries. This is most apparent in places like Africa and North America. On the other hand, countries and nations that formed naturally over time typically consist of organic borders, designated by natural geographic barriers such as rivers, mountains, and lakes. These features produce significant geographic biomes and features that bred cultures and peoples who had to adapt, master, overcome, and overall evolve to survive and thrive in their respective region, which led to very unique cultural and linguistic specializations, such as the case with the peoples of Tibet, which have a very unique and distinctive culture and physiology conducive to spending the past several thousands of years in the highest mountain range on Earth. But we'll touch on this more later. In some cases, borders were created through warfare and treaties between rivaling states. In the creation of modern African countries, this natural and organic phenomenon of border evolution did not take place, as it was entirely under the rule of European nations in a period that spanned roughly between the late 19th and the mid 20th century, with the exception of Ethiopia, which successfully fought off a full-scale Italian invasion. Kwame Nkrumah once stated that the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was what led to the original carve-up of African borders. However, this notion causes many to assume that Africa was a boundless, stateless frontier ripe for the taking prior to colonialism, or a terra nullius, a Latin word meaning no man's land, which was applied to lands in which Europeans deemed to be stateless societies that could justifiably be conquered and civilized by them. A concept that somewhat mirrors that of the manifest destiny practiced in the United States. In reality, African peoples have been controlling states, kingdoms, and empires that occupied large amounts of land all throughout the continent since prehistoric times, a fact that is still largely unknown by many, and further complicated by the plethora of overly simplified depictions of pre-colonial Africa as a land predominantly composed of small tribes and a small number of blob-like states with inconsistent and irregular borders. It is a fact, however, that African peoples largely lacked any strong cartographic traditions, a fact that often led researchers like Alder to assume that Africans lacked the cognitive abilities to do so, or as he put it, "We are all the more surprised that the Negroes do not draw well, considering the delicate wood and metal carvings in which they are capable." If black people really did lack the ability to draw, then frankly I or this background wouldn't even exist right now. African peoples did have indigenous traditions that were analogous to cartography, but that's a topic for an entirely different video. What we'll cover in this one, however, is that they did have several other means of asserting their dominance over specific regions, while also making it clear to their neighbors where their international borders rested, and without the use of pen or paper. One of the most popular methods was most frequently found in West Africa, known as a border march or zone. These zones consisted of military patrols who constantly roved the limits of the kingdom in order to enforce its laws, influence, and taxes on anyone within it. This zone could also be marked by an area in which two ethnic groups coexisted side by side, despite their differences, just as the case with the towns around the US-Mexico border, in which the populations consist of a mixture of American and Mexican peoples, with populations being more homogeneous as one moves further away from this zone. It has been observed that this is the type of border that existed between the Fon kingdom of Dahomey and the Yoruba kingdom of Oyo. A frontier of separation was another type of indigenous African border, which was effectively a no man's land. These types of borders were typically unclaimed by either state and more often than not consisted of undesirable lands such as deserts, swamps, or terrain that was just unfavorable to agriculture. In turn, they provided natural buffers between neighboring kingdoms. This is why many maps of pre-colonial Africa often feature states separated by vast expanses of unclaimed land. The borders between the Bornu and the Air kingdoms had these types of borders, as land between the two states was nothing more than barren desert. The last type of border we will discuss is known as an enclave. Enclave borders are typically marked by a group of people who share strong ethnic and linguistic identity, oftentimes as a result of geography. As discussed earlier in this video, geographic and climatic biomes can have a strong effect on the development of ethnic groups and states. One modern example of this is the African country of Lesotho, which is totally inside of South Africa and is located almost entirely in the mountains and highlands. As a result, 99.7% of its inhabitants belong to the Sotho ethnic group, which have strong cultural traditions adapted over time to suit their lifestyle up in these highlands. In fact, due to its altitude, Lesotho is one of the few parts of sub-Saharan Africa to receive regular annual snowfall, and features a climate comparable to the one found in the temperate zones of Eurasia and North America, with the traditions of the indigenous Sotho people reflecting that, such as the blankets that they manufacture with a name that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. I mean, normally I'll give it an honest effort, but beginning with the Berlin Conference of 1884, several European nations collectively initiated a continent-wide conquest of Africa, in which they discussed among themselves who would gain what parts of the continent in an effort to avoid conflict with one another. You know, not who cares about the Africans, just one another. In other words, these European nations had total disregard for the sovereign African states and kingdoms that had already existed in the region, and that these African peoples were more than likely completely unaware of this conference that was taking place. In fact, most of the continent was completely unknown or undiscovered by Europeans during this time. So in other words, these Europeans were literally just drawing lines and borders on a blank map of Africa, since all they really knew about was the coastline and a few other inland areas. In a period that spanned roughly just 2 to 3 decades, Europeans colonized the whole of the African continent with the exception of Liberia, which was an American territory, and Ethiopia. This European invasion of Africa was done by the utilization of advanced military technology such as repeating rifles, Gatling guns, and rocket artillery. Technology that allowed them to consistently win battles, despite being grossly outnumbered. In other words, the continent was carved up into new and artificial, clunky, and awkward borders that had never existed on the continent before. Ones that ignored cultural, ethnic, geographic, and climate zones, often separating similar peoples while forcing enemies into the same borders. This process effectively shattered several trade networks, cities, states, kingdoms, and empires that had developed indigenously over time, some existing for thousands of years. This hodgepodge of borders being drawn right through former kingdoms, separating people into several nations while forcing rivaling peoples together, all the while being forced to speak foreign languages, practice foreign religions, and pay taxes to foreign rulers who gave little to nothing back in return, led to a chain reaction of problems on the African continent for years to come, problems that still plague the continent to present day. The Igbo people of Nigeria, for example, have historically squabbled with their Yoruba neighbors for centuries, but were forced to live within the same borders once they were colonized by the British. After Nigeria gained independence in the 1960s, a series of military dictators came to power, leading to corruption in the government that favored specific ethnic groups, and the Igbo faced heavy discrimination as a result of this. Within just a few years, tension manifested into full-on civil war, when the Igbo broke free to form their own country, known as Biafra. And as recently as 2014, South Sudan also broke free of Sudan due to radically different rivaling ethnic groups and climate zones being forced to share the same borders. This is a pattern that continues to present in much of Africa, several diverse peoples forced into strange borders that they've never had to share with one another at any point in history, with ethnic tension fueling corrupt and ethnically biased leadership, leading to rampant poverty, civil war, and corrupted and unstable governments. If African states were allowed to develop and modernize on their own terms, we'd see a much more stable continent, and quite frankly, we'd see borders that actually make sense. Africans were no strangers to sovereign states or strictly defined borders before colonization, but unfortunately, very few of today's colonial borders have changed. Inevitably, this has led to civil unrest and economic instability. Perhaps in the future, some of these African nations to come to mutual agreements and allow more autonomy among ethnic groups in their respective indigenous regions. Thanks for watching, guys, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.